Autumn 910. Osric held the parchment, stolen as it had been from Dunnottar, from Constantine's hand as he slept, no less, close to the sun, and read it again. Not read it, but looked at the letters on it, looked at the ink and the skin. It was familiar to her, though Osric would not have been able to place it unless she had been at Kells and had had the privilege of serving Malmuir in sourcing the squid ink that the monks needed to complete the illumination on the manuscript. She did not know whether it was Domhnall's hand, but seemed like what he would write, his conversation, his style. In it, the words told the king of Alba the news that a great number of battles had been fought to prevent the Norse from ever re-establishing a hold in Meich, Briefn and Leinster, and on the north coast of their territory. Osric felt her blade scabbard, at the marks on it. It had been he, Domhnall Uineal, at Dund, who had taught Osric to read and write the Ogham lines, one such line across the Gaelish coronation stone into which she has witnessed Domhnall thrust his foot. They represented Latin letters first before representing Gaelish, and each set of lines represented not only an script letter but also a living thing, oak, willow, ash, thorn, and Osric smiled the warmth of their time, walking together, where the would-be king of the Ullaid told how he had been taught the script through the trees by lewes, fern, seal, in, birch, rowan, alder, willow, ash, in the form of a poem with rhythm. The sun warmed Osric's back as she sat by the Tyne river and looked at the letter again. She sometimes missed her old friend who had, at last, gone back to his homeland, and she looked again at the Gaelish which told that Neil Glundube, once a little grubby-kneed prince in her care, had struck in alliance with his stepfather, Flan Sinner, but that Flan was losing his grip on the north. He, presumably Domhnall, had sided with Neil when Flan sought to have Neil killed, but that Flan had deserted Doir and headed west after a vicious Norse raid. Osric looked across the river, at approximately the point, by her reckoning, that her ancestor, Oswald, had seen his vision of Comsill which told of his victory over his uncle Edwin, or of the time later when Cuthbert, having had a salmon dropped at his feet by a passing eagle, cut the fish in half and threw one half back to the bird. She looked at the sky, bright blue, the season deceiver, as September was on the moon, and the whole world in Northumbria still felt as if it basked in high summer. A few more nights and, as if summer had turned its back on the land, winter frosts would begin. The parchment fell open in Osric's fingers again. Any excuse to stop beside the river again, with her morning star lapping at the water with her tongue. If Domhnall was indeed there was the author, then he meant all of the Ullaid princes living in the north were fighting beside Flan Sinner to repel the Norse and Danes from the coastal fringes. Idly, Osric wondered where Fedasword was now, that of hers, and Utad's father, that she had taken when she had escaped Wittenberg. Nine Fingers was a prince still in Eirian. After all this time, Osric still did not know his name, nor that of his brother. Their land had been taken by Flan, as had Briefn. Were they dead? Osric sincerely hoped so. And she pictured in her mind the blade, shorter, thinner, but no less strong than Bué. There had been so many times when the juvenile Osric imagining presenting it to Utad and he would have been overjoyed and welcomed her with open arms. How stupidly green that sounded now. But number. Now she read it again. Osric could see that the author had not meant that Flan had fought the Norse, but had, instead, sided with the Norse. She had forgotten some of the grammar she had once known. Flan was the object, not the subject. It must have been written by Domhnall, and when he spoke of fighting with the king, he must have meant Neil. How Osric's heart began to sing, and she allowed her mind to wander back to her time there, at Doir, at Malmuir's wedding, at Dara. All mellow memories to warm a heart, though not a place of warmth where bitter alliances had to be forged to continue to repel the Norse on their land. Then, she wondered how strange memory was, that brought back some things, but not others. Mainly, happy, safe things. She crumpled the paper, then opened it again, allowing the sunlight to shine on the parchment, before folding it neatly away, then fixed her mind on the task in hand. Osric was to be back in Mercia. Much she had to tell Constantine, so he could work it into his own domestic and international plans. She told him of Bibbenberg, and remembered the time she had nearly left the Danes and stood beside King Domnall, beside Constantine and Domnall and Sainid. She told him of Tenhulg, and of the injury Ethliad had received, substantial. And she was to be back in Mercia, amongst the chaos of succession. If it had been her, Osrith knew that she would be sending her back, too, because therein lay the potential of everything. Whoever would take Mercia as its leader, wherever that person's allegiances lay, would determine the interactions of other kingdoms. And, like one rock placed in the sand next to another, stood up in their end, then pushed over, Mercia would knock into its neighboring kingdoms, and eventually that knock would be felt in Alba. But not before the effect had passed through Pitland and restless Strathclyde. He had been short with her. Unusually, Edra was pleased to see Osrith, and in her, she saw a beautiful young woman in the making, with the colouring and features of her mother, Thyra. As the girl showed Osrith with bounteous enthusiasm, 7 lines meaning the same thing, the sun and the wind and the sky change not translated into each of the languages she knew. And it was the first time Osrith realized the girl's deep intelligence wrought from her father. Bika, Mama, and I know the Pictish writing, she declared, and took Osrith into one of the rooms below the waterline, which must have cost a good deal for Constantine's grandfather to have made, for it was bone dry, and pointed to the large stones which had once been features of the Pictish kingdom, now brought to the Picts' capital for some unknown reason in the distant past. Indulf, or rather, Ildub, of the Black Isle, was her dearest friend, firstborn of Constantine and never from her side. Selark, Constantine's firstborn, was with them too, but Edra and Indulf would run off from the boy and pretend to hide, or ignore him and pretend that they never heard him calling them. In his turn, Constantine's eldest would pretend he didn't care, and go to seek out Malcolm, Domnall's son, and talk to him about battles and war and strategy. On the day that Osrith had witnessed both her willful adopted daughter and Constantine's image run off to the spinney outside the fortress, she saw Selark's sad eyes follow them, and a pang of hopeful sadness pierced Osrith's heart. How she had once wanted to feel like that with Utad, the brother of her imaginings. To Edra, Ildub would never be parted from her. Yet, one day he would be. He had already fought Osrith in the square beside the stables at Dunnottar, where Sainid looked on, approvingly at the boy. One day, he would be amongst troops, then lead troops, all to strengthen their homeland, and not for the first time, Osrith thought of how well Domnall and then Constantine had united the petty kingdoms in Alba, and how well they held. And yet Osrith thought about the Picts' stones again. This was a different culture entirely to the Gaels, and she wondered, had Domnall and Constantine left their homeland as Picts and come back as Gaels? Constantine's church reforms and his nobility restructure suggested so. The stones could be read, so Edra had told her, by a certain placement of certain symbols within the pictures, which told the reader which image to look at next. While it seemed easy to Edra, Osrith could not fathom it, much preferring Ogham, which Edra quickly informed her adoptive mother that she had mastered even before Norse. It was more than Osrith had been taught. She remembered when Constantine had mocked her ignorance, and locked her in the dark and cold one day, when she wouldn't do something he wanted. It had been Sainid who had found her. Sainid. It must have been 30 years ago when she first met Kingsguard. He must have been a young man then, though he was grown, and Osrith was still a child. A good man, one who had done his duty to the crown of Alba, as now was, thanks to Domnall's unifying ambition, for so many years. And he had greeted Osrith as if she had merely been in the courtyard, or strolling by the firth, rather than having spent 2 years away, at Bibbenberg, at Winchester, at Tenhulg. And so it had been her dear friend with whom Osrith had confided her secret, and not Constantine, not yet. It had been strange, for the potent life inside her, making itself known by the swelling of her stomach, by her voracious appetite, by her bouts of sudden lethargy, the babe was hers and Finan's alone. But she could not keep her joy from Sainid, who had touched her hand in the reassuring way he had about him, and presumed nothing of her that Osrith was not willing to share. When she had finished, Constantine's chief guard smiled warmly, as if it could have been his own child, and kissed Osrith on the forehead. She suspected Constantine knew she kept a secret, knew she concealed something, and he resented her for it. Not a hot anger, but a cold one, which is why it made it easy for Osrith to take the letter from his hand, and headed south to her duty. Osrith wondered whether Finan would, if he ever would, take this path north to Alba. He had asked her to marry him, and she had agreed, if only, he came to fetch her. So it was up to him, and she would wait. And if he never came, Osrith would never marry, and the child would grow up in Alba and speak Gaelish. At least it was the language of his father, and the culture of his father. And he might yet come. She had to go, Osrith knew, and she made to stand, from her very pleasant resting place beside the crackling water over small stones, and made to lead her horse through the trickle east. And these waters built, from a gentle dance over pebbles to a roaring tumult though deep channels until it met the eastern sea. She looked around again, at her land, at Northumbria, and then back to where the Roman wall demarked the end of their empire centuries before, the border which Constantine claimed the land, and over which, sooner or later, a conflict would be waged. But not yet. Now, the conflict was in Mercia, where no one lord had a strong enough claim to hold Aylesbury, and trouble was boiling. Crunching up the Irian parchment and pushing it into her bindings, which she knew she would have to discard one of these days, Osrith pulled herself up onto her horse, and thought again of Senedd, and Alba, and peace. It was where she was going to give birth to their child. Of that, Osrith was determined, not in the war-torn, nascent, nebulous kingdoms of England, not Mercia, where she had sworn to fight, and could now no longer do that as a mother. And under no circumstances that odious kingdom of Wessex. 88,888,888. Yet, when she got to the ridge which gently sloped into the plain where Aylesbury lay, the familiar feeling of home passed over Osrith, and her eye looked forgivingly upon Aylesbury, its serene position, glimmering at the point on the horizon that drew the viewer's eye, wondering how much peace the city really did hold. Ethelred, if he was not dead, would be ill, and there were several family factions who would be fighting for power. She looked back over her shoulder again. Go on, or go back. And back to what? This is where the spying would be most effective, and she could gather a great deal of intelligence. It was not as if the road down had been peaceful, although Osrith counted herself lucky she hadn't encountered much trouble down Ermine Street. 2 thieves were easily dispatched, and she had come across another lone traveller, who had turned out to be a travelling entertainer, with his dog. Eswe had seemed harmless enough, but still, Osrith slept with one eye open. But it had not made much difference to Eswe, who had slept, curled up nose to nose, with his dog, a blanket over him most of the night. And now there was a dark smudge ahead of her, like a storm cloud fallen to earth. Unmistakably a small band of soldiers. Osrith gripped Morning Star's rein as she watched it move. Danes. But she had passed over Watling Street, and Danes would not dare to be so close to Aylesbury. Unless ... it couldn't possibly. It was unthinkable that Aylesbury had been taken, surely she would have heard. But if these were mercenaries, why were they riding such? And where were their foot soldiers? Osrith had little time to consider much at the speed the riders were coming, and she slowed Morning Star to a brisk trot, all the better to ignite her muscles if Osrith needed to make a quick getaway, and she withdrew away. A rider from the group broke first, and charged at Osrith, nearly knocking her blade from her hand with his own. That was the distraction. The real movement was to distract her long enough to not notice the rest of the men circle her, but unfortunately for them, Aldhelm had trained her, and she could see the men split off. She circled Morning Star round, smashing her blade flat on towards the now offensively swung blade. It was not enough to stop the thrust, but enough to slow it, and it caught Osrith's sleeve, leaving a red line across her upper arm. Another swung past her ear, and she only just ducked in time. Mercenguard, she called, as another blade attacked her. I am an auxiliary captain, made so by the Lord Oldham himself. Another, and this one even made the usually placid morning star stir on her hooves. This had done it. All bar one blade drew back at once, and Osith turned morning star in a tight circle to find the wide-edged weapon sweep near her temple. "Stop, I say," Osrith demanded. "Since when do the Mercen Guard attack a stranger without first making his intentions known to them beforehand?" The soldier looked as if he was about to swipe at her again, when another man dashed the blade from his hand. The man looked outraged, but the first drew his horse closer, and grinned at her. "Osrith, Miral!" she exclaimed, then looked around at the green and gold-clad soldiers fall back into a clearly practiced position. It was just that such a formation seemed to be practiced now, one which would tire any company if every stranger were to be attacked first rather than conversed with. Their warrior beside Miral held his sword high still, however. Osrith ignored him. "Why do you ride such?" she asked, as the company turned to ride back to Aylesbury, and only then she realized how long ago it was since she had last been there. "We have enemies." "Enemies everywhere." But Osrith laughed. "Surely not." But Miral was not laughing, and Osrith straightened her face and remembered the dire situation she remembered her lord to be in. "Ethliad, is he dead?" At this, Miral shook his head. "He is not dead, and I fear this is the problem. The lords do fight, and promise faction, because no decision can be made. No leadership can lead. Danes threaten. And who is this lord here, scowling at me?" Miral grinned again. "This is Bergud, the Lord Bergud's son." He nodded towards the unremitting young man, whose blade was still not sheathed. It was down, though, for Miral had lowered the boy's fist with his own firm hand. "I think I remember you," Osrith told Berg. "You must have been a child when last I was here." "Are you in your 15th/16th year?" Berg stared at her, and said nothing. For that, Miral gave him a slap around the back of his head. "She is your captain," Miral declared. "She is every Mercen's captain," he continued, then, as the rest of the guards cheered softly their approval, "You will answer her." Now, Berg turned his head slowly, insolently, towards Osrith. 16, he agreed, and Osrith's mind remembered a small child, of about 3, who had been chasing around after the young girl Eadith in the gardens, whose brother had forced Ethliad's hand. She had no more assassinated Ethelfled as she had harmed the girl. But there had been a vengeful, no, a calculated look in Eadwulf's eye, one conveying his resignation to life's struggles and deciding what was worth his effort. Aldhelm had told her their father had lost money gambling, but not at cards, at estates, between earldomen. Alfred had forbidden that sort of thing in Wessex, but, thankfully, Mercia was independent of Wessex and could decide itself. Plus, being a border country, rather than a stable, richer kingdom, Mercia's stakes were much higher, given that one could be a shawl in the morning and in the afternoon a lord. Plus, it benefited Ethliad, who would fine people on an ad hoc basis if a land dispute became personal and threatened the peace of Mercia. A royal guard was on the ramparts of the city of Aylesbury as Osrith slowed Morning Star. As she looked again, she realized it was not Mercen, but Wessex, and she felt her stomach lurch. More dire than even Miral suggested, if Edward had chanced to make his presence felt in Mercia, it meant he could smell the crown. He could feel more steps being taken towards a unified Saxon land, with Mercen identity annaled into one Saxon identity. "Care," Miral told her, as they rode through the gates, opened, at least nominally, by Mercens, for feelings run high. He allowed his guard to ride to the stables, nodding Osrith through past another of the guards, and he put out a hand to help Osrith down. "We cannot talk here," he added. They walked through the wide streets of Aylesbury, not cramped and tightly packed like the former Roman city of Winchester was. Aylesbury had the advantage of space around it, and though vulnerable to attack, was a well-fortified burg. At just above eye height the inner palisade wall ran, with an outer, taller and thicker main wall just beyond. Soldiers patrolled the palisade, and operated in the sun's turn pattern, each man moving to their right as the sun moved. This gave the advantage of being able to see different views about the city, and, where a man may become complacent, staring at the same scenery, the view was always fresh and the soldier alert. Miral led Osrith towards the northern end of the city. From above, the soldiers here would be able to see Watling Street, the border of Daneland, and more soldiers were concentrated on this area of the fortifications. Ahead of them, a row of houses clearly belonging to some of the more well-to-do residents of Aylesbury. The houses were larger, the rooms bigger. One house stood just beyond, abutting, almost, the northern section of the palisade. The tree-thick supports were mere inches from the outer wall. It was built by Roman stone, Miral explained. This was once the palace. Once the palace? Osrith exclaimed, as she looked at the well-placed, irregular stones as they fitted into one another. There did not seem any mortar to hold them in place, and Osrith wondered how it held up. "Does it meet with your approval?" Miral asked, when they stepped inside. Underfoot were tiny mosaics, of the Roman style, their bright blues and oranges seeming to glow with the morning sun as she held open the door. More than Roman style, Miral told her, when she said this floor is Roman. The people who built this rebuilt it on a Roman site. But no one uses it now. So he swung his hand around the room, and smiled as Osrith. It was beautiful, well furnished. A bed was beyond a little alcove, and a low wooden bench sat opposite a table. A chimney had been fashioned, rather than a hole in the ceiling, and cooking could go on there. Miral went towards the back, where a small courtyard lay beyond a double-hinged door, enclosed by more stone walls fixed together by nothing, it seemed, with the thatches of other buildings overhanging the walls. It gave Osrith the impression of a tucked-away, secluded dwelling that was hard to chance upon. "I like it," Osrith agreed, the sunlight catching her hair. "But, what are you showing me?" "Your home, should you want it, in Aylesbury," he told her, then stepped back inside, carefully closing the doors behind him. "Should anyone ask, you are visiting me. It used to be rooms of the Merson royal family. Nobody cared that I took it." He turned, and smiled, then waved a hand at the stone-built room. It was high quality, and spacious. It was fit, indeed, for royalty. "Yours, should you want it, while you visit." Osrith opened her mouth in amazement. She was expecting a struggle to enter the city in any case, but to be escorted in, and shown accommodation was amazingly generous, if not a little confusing. "I must tell you, Miral," Osrith began, "I did not seek to rejoin the Merson army." She looked around the room again. "And nor should you. That man who you offended, all those years ago, Eardwulf, he has risen high enough to influence Ethelred, or has influenced him, shall we say." He shook his head. "Clearly, you are here for some purpose, and I will not have you involved in the intrigue which has gripped the city." He did not press it, however, but there was a gap in the conversation available for Osrith to fill. It was not that she was looking to be part of Mercia again. Indeed, she was spying for Alba, for Constantine. But Osrith had been feeling that certain detached feeling that she remembered from pregnancy, and the flying away of cares of conniving plotting, intricate details of other people's problems. "I do not wish to be involved in Mercia's problems, though I confess, I came here for the safety Aylesbury offers, and to earn that safety by working." She glanced at the door, left Wessex. She almost spat the name, under a bad reputation shortly after Alfred's death. Osrith closed her mouth, so that she would sat no more. "But you returned to Mercia," Miral observed, gesturing towards the table's bench, and Osrith found she was grateful to sit. "And you fought well at Tenhulg against the Danes and Norse." He leaned towards Osrith. "I saw you try to save Aldhelm." Osrith closed her eyes for a moment, as she remembered, feeling her own hand meet her forehead. Aldhelm. He was a dear friend, the like of whom she would never again know. "So, whatever your business is here, Lackland, here is a place to be. No one need know if you so desire it." "I am placing you in danger," Osrith suggested, trying to rid herself of the image of being just that little too late to save her commander, to save a good man, a moral man. to whom land was first and duty second. She stepped towards Miral, but Miral laughed and shook his head. No one will notice. No one will care. This land is about to be wrenched apart unless a suitable successor is found. More than it is already, he added. And I suggest you keep away from the actual palace, or at least conceal yourself. People who had heard the rumor before, of murder and sorcery, will still remember, and in these turbulent times, mistakes can be made in the name of security. You knew? Osrith gasped. She found she had gripped the oak bench with her other hand and was holding on to it, hard. I knew. I also know these to be false. How could they be? He added, to reassure her. I spent years and years working alongside you, Osrith. Saw you fight, saw you command men. People spread lies, people spread rumor, to gain influence, to gain power. You are safe here, Osrith, he reassured her. And you can stay here. It is out of the way, it is unused. It is generous, she nodded. It is haunted, so they say, Miral confessed. No one will bother you here. But Osrith shook her head. Even north of Wessex, there were no Sai here, no Morrigan. Nothing would harm her here. Nothing haunts here, for me, at least. Shadow walkers, Miral said, with a quickness that betrayed thought. Osrith laughed, for she neither believed in nor had experienced these particular otherworldly creatures. This is kind, Osrith replied, nodding in agreement, deciding there and then that there would be no Osrith in Mercia when she was gone so far that her condition could not be concealed. That would bring more trouble, more difficulty. Constantine would have to put up with her in Alba, and for that, again, she would need silver. She could work. She would work, and would have enough to begin a life for the child in Alba. You do not help me entirely out of the goodness of your heart, Osrith replied, and I may say you have a good heart, Miral. He laughed again. No, indeed. I confess, I saw an opportunity, though you flatter me. Miral laughed. Mercia needs guards, Mercia needs men, although in your case, men who are women, to guard its walls. You will be anonymous, one of Ethlird's guards. However, you must rescind your role of auxiliary commander. Gladly, Osrith agreed. Though may I say, I have been honored to receive such a position. Miral, old helm. Her voice tailed to nothing, and she swallowed the lump that had formed, then changed tack. So yes, I will be a soldier. I will serve, quietly, soberly, and conceal myself for intelligence for you. For that serves both of our purposes, she told herself, and reminded herself of the good fortune that had fallen across her path. What of the men under your command? She was thinking of Berg, who had taken a dislike to her almost instantly, and would have to be watched. I will think of something. You swore to Ethelred, and have come to avail yourself of sanctuary. That is true, is it not? Osrith nodded. Stay here, Osrith, Miral said. I will send clothing for you. A guard's uniform, undermail and a helmet. No one will ever know it's you. He crossed the straw-covered floor, and took the handle of the door. Just one thing. Eardwulf, as I said. Osrith watched Miral's face frown. Eardwulf? Osrith asked. She recognized the name, but could not place it, until Miral said, you don't remember? He had a sister, he made a fuss about you to Lord Ethelred. Had Ethelred send you away? Eardwulf, Osrith thought, dully. Aldhelm had been right, though she killed in battle, she was no assassin. What about him? He commands the Mercen Guard, in fact he commands all the guard, and not well. He has advised Lord Ethelred very poorly in the past. We fought in East Anglia, which is what delayed us into Tenholg. There was no need to go east, when we needed to secure our own land west and north, and that has resulted in Edward feeling he must play caretaker. Ethelred, Unrad, Osrith murmured. Badly advised, Miral translated. He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. He has indeed been that. But the Lord lingers, and the situation is growing more unsteady by the day. Edward seeks to interfere in the Witton. The Mercen Lords, of course, do not welcome that. The Lady Ethelfled, she is here? Osrith did not mean to interrupt so loudly, and she fell silent again. She is here, to be beside her husband, Miral said, pointedly. For show, Osrith thought, wryly, to be close to power. And if she is here, so will my brother, the absolute heel. And then a faint glow in the gloom of her mind ignited. Finan would be the two. Then, she shook her head, chiding herself from thinking of him, her hand slipping to her jerkin, where, within, her coin was concealed. So, not to the palace, not anywhere you might endanger yourself, of course. But I know the guards speak amongst themselves, and I would very much like to know what they are saying. He brightened. And there are 3 people who would very much like to see you again, I am sure, he added. Elfkin, Egelfrith, Oshir, the very same. All fought bravely at Tenholg, all won themselves glory. Miral got up, and strode to the front door, holding it open. Osrith got to her feet and surprised herself when her head swam. He looked at her for a moment, but Osrith was striding towards him as good as she ever walked. Eat in the palace kitchens, use the armory, but please remain anonymous. There is too much going on, and it changes hourly. Osrith nodded, and they walked back along the street to where these larger nobles' houses fell apart to a courtyard beside the palace proper. Miral, I have to know. Osrith caught him by the shoulder. He stopped and looked at her as she continued, where do you lie on the matter? A union of Saxons, or an independent Mercia? Her once adversary smiled. It matters not to me, Miral said, so long as there is no war between us. And at the moment, I can very much see that one may start over this. He lowered his head to her ear. I need to know what the men think. They feel they cannot talk freely amongst themselves for fear of Eardwulf's men, and this will only get compounded when Edward of Wessex appears with the West Saxons. Osrith nodded. So, I need you to tell me anything that you hear. Anything passed to you in confidence. It is vital all Aldhelm's men remain Mercen in their heart.